بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. We continuing our reading of Habermas's comments on Klein's conception of rationality. I stopped here last time at the bottom. We'll just go back a bit. Klein looks for a curious way out of the dilemma. We looked at the dilemma in detail last time. The touchstone for differences in what is valid is not their differences in truth content, for who could decide this, but the eminently effective logic of argumentation. So after we have rejected the traditional objectivity, traditional notions of objectivity, without rejecting the notion of truth, we don't have any other way to access or to assess the validity of an argument except from within argumentation, from within a participant's perspective. So the term effectiveness is systematically ambiguous in this context. This is Habermas says. If arguments are valid, then insight into the internal conditions of their validity can have a rationally motivating force and a corresponding effect. So what we are looking for is validity determined by the power of the force of better argument alone. But there are other forces present. There are other forces present within argumentation, even in a strictly guarded argumentative situation as well. But arguments can also have influences on the attitudes of addressees independently of their validity. The contextual influences, non-rational influences, psychological as well as sociological, on the attitude of addressees independently of their validity when they are expressed in external circumstances. So the question is how to minimize these external circumstances so that they don't interfere with the better force of the argument. Addressees external circumstances that guarantee their acceptance. Whereas the effectiveness of argument can be explained in the second case by means of a psychology of argumentation, explanation in the first case called for a logic of argumentation. So ideally what we are looking for is not the psychology, but the logic of argumentation will guide the acceptance of validity claims. That's the object or objective. Now we had covered this part, so now today we are starting from here. Klein postulates, however, a third aspect, namely a logic of argumentation that investigates. Now the question becomes how to determine the logic of investigation. So Klein postulates a third aspect, namely a logic of argumentation that investigates validity connections as law-like empirical regularities, without having recourse to the concept of objective validity. It is supposed to depict the laws to which participants in argumentations are subject. More like conditions, I guess. That's why. In some cases against their inclinations. So these are structural, for example, limits or structural conditions. And in opposition to external influences. So the object of these law-like regularities for Klein is to minimize external non-rational or even anti-rational influences. Such a theory has to analyze what appear to participants as internal connection between valid utterance as external connection between events as internal connection between events linked nomenologically. So apparently, according to Habermas, let's dwell on this a bit. So let's see what is the problematic. What is the problematic? So we are trying to determine how, in the face of rejection of the concept of, or the realist concept of, objective validity, we can salvage the concept of validity from within, so to speak, subjectively. Subjective here is what we are looking for, is intersubjectivity. That is, intersubjectivity is from within. By intersubjectivity we mean from within an argumentative situation, from a participant's perspective. So how can we put limits or specify the conditions of this argument so that from the perspective of participants from within argumentation is not merely intersubjective, but this intersubjectivity is connected to some sort of detranscendentalize objectivity. So that's the object, or that's the objective, and I would assume that Habermas and Klein agrees on this objective. But what Habermas is criticizing here Klein for the way he tries to resolve or realize this objective. And Habermas's critique seems to be that what Klein does is try to come up with the laws of argumentation. Empirical laws of argumentation. By observing the regularities or law-like regularities within an argumentation. And what Habermas is saying is what Klein is doing is, like we empirical regularities in the external world, so that they are noticed by physicists, for example, and on the basis of that they discover physical laws. Klein takes this model and apply it to, according to Habermas, apply it to the participant's situation within an argument from the perspective of the participants in the argument. So what he tries to, according to Habermas, discover is regularities. Within argument. The regularities which might even be beyond the intention and even the inclinations of the participant, just because they are within an argumentative situation, some things happen. The A, B, C, D, different people arguing about something, discussing something from a participant's perspective, and you observe them, I don't know, from outside or from inside, self-reflectively, and see if there are regularities in argument 1, 2, 3, the regularities which might give us some clue as to the laws of argumentation which operate within an argumentative situation beyond the inclination and the will of the participants. These regularities, because they are within the participant's situation, within the argumentative situation, these regularities, so we are looking for those regularities only which are connected to the logic of argumentation, not anything which is external. And that seems to, and Klein's focus seems to be, according to Habermas, on the analysis of what appears to the phenomenology of appear to the participants. What appear to the participants within argumentation as internal connection between valid utterances. So probably by observing a lot of different argumentative situations, you try to observe regularities. What are those regularities? What are those constants which operate or which appear to participants, that makes an utterance valid as against that makes an utterance invalid. And probably what he is trying to discover in this way is rules based on these regularities, which will help us to differentiate between two types of influences within argument. External influence, which is not related to argument, so that should be cancelled, and influences which are actually internal or internal to validity. So the hope is that those rules would be the guiding principle through which we can differentiate between two types of effect and then cancel the external effects and enhance the internal effects, the effects which are related to the validity. I think Habermas' objection would not be to those rules, but how those rules are conceived. For Habermas, those rules cannot be empirical laws, even if they are empirical laws from within or empirical laws based on the phenomenology of the participants' perspective as it is related to the internal connection between the validity claims and the validity itself. What Habermas would rather look is the conditions which are, or rules which are non-empirical, and for him those would be based on specifying the argumentative situation, the conditions, and also would be based on the linguistic conditions. Argumentative situation-related condition and linguistic condition which are more likely to lead us to minimizing the external influence and maximizing the validity-related influences on an argumentative situation. That's my impression so far. Okay, let's read it a bit once more and then move on. Klein postulates our third aspect, namely a logic of argumentation that investigates validity connections as law-like empirical regularities without having without having recourse to concepts of objective validity. It is supposed to depict the laws to which participants in argumentation are subject, in some cases against their inclinations and in opposition to external influences. Such a theory has to analyze what appear to participants as internal connections between valid utterances as external connections between events linked nomenologically. Klein is able to pass off the dilemma that he himself sees only at the cost of a deliberate category mistake. He requires of the logic of argumentation a task that could only be carried out by a nomenological theory of observable behavior, so regularity based rather than evaluative or normative. I believe that in the systematic analysis of actual argumentation, as in every empirical analysis, relatively fixed regularities can be found. So fixed regular. So these are empirical regularities, but the regularities of what regularities we are observing is the behavior of the argument participants and how they come to true and valid arguments. Precisely the logic of argument. But for Habermas, logic of argumentation is a normative concept which cannot be accessed through empirical analysis. And I believe, furthermore, that the concept covers much of what is usually understood as the rationality of argumentation. Okay. It's clear. So rationality of argumentation for Klein. So you are looking for rationality for argumentation, but to discover that rationality, what Klein is suggesting is that we actually observe the actual patterns of actual argumentation. And if we find that in valid arguments certain things always happen, and in their absence invalidity occurs, for example. So through those variations we might be able to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions. So whenever valid argument is present, if certain conditions are always present, then probably we can isolate them as certain conditions are, if certain conditions are always present when valid argument is present and never present when when valid argument is not valid, so probably we can think of those as necessary. And similarly, the standard method, I guess a million sort of method to isolate necessary and sufficient conditions. That seems to be Klein's, but I think Habermas's point is, like Brandom, for example, that rationality is a normative concept. Validity, it can't be discovered through just looking at the patterns of valid arguments. We have to go beyond that. Klein wants to cultivate the logic of argumentation as a nomenological theory. That's what he means by nomenological theory, that empirical, and thus he has to assimilate rules to causal regularities, reason to causes. The old debate between whether the difference between reason and cause, etc. So I think we'll stop here and we'll continue from here. And probably in the meanwhile, we can look at some of the literature dealings with the distinction between reason and causes. That will help us to deepen our understanding of this difference.